So what we were doing in the last couple of classes was to look into the scheme of Indian Evidence Act and to understand the nuances of what we call the evidence law and how evidence law is different from other procedural legislations that you would be studying this semester and onwards. The idea was to lay a foundation on which the superstructure of our discussions, further discussions, more intensive discussions, more topical discussions could be based. And these classes also, in fact, attempt to do the same, because it's essential, it's necessary that before we take up individual provision sections, as we call, you are thorough with certain basic issues. And a few basic issues have already been dealt. A few more would be done today, tomorrow, or maybe another class would be sufficient, another class hour would be sufficient, and then formal topical discussion into the Indian Evidence Act would commence. So you remember that in the last class I had talked about two rival schools, two opposite views about the law of evidence and its ambit and scope and what it should deal with. One school that I had referred to as a no holds barred school, which argues that the parties should be at liberty to adduce whatever evidence they want, and the court must listen to each and every. Submission made by the parties vis-a-vis evidence in their possession or evidence that they seek to proffer. And the other school, which says that no, if each and every fact that the parties wish to prove in order to get their rights and liabilities determined is allowed, that would lead to utter chaos, unending courtroom drama with no end in sight would be the order of the day. So it's necessary that we draw boundaries based on certain principles, not arbitrarily drawn, of course, based on certain principles, where only certain facts would be allowed. And they call those certain facts as relevant facts. The no holds barred school which it seems that claims that there should not be any rule as to what facts are admissible and what facts are not. And every fact which a party wishes to adduce. Every evidence which a party wishes to adduce must be allowed. In fact, don't mean that much. Somewhere they would also be understanding that everything that happens in your life may not be relevant to the claim that you have made before the court, or in order to determine your rights and liabilities. So somewhere they also seek to limit, but not in so many words. But the other school, which makes better sense, I had told you, for reasons that I had discussed in detail, wants those rules in black and white, neatly drawn, precisely and concisely laid down, which shall determine as to what facts a court can rely on and what evidence a party would be allowed to adduce and produce and proffer in the proceedings before the court. So somewhere in both the schools, there is this idea of what we call relevant facts within court, relevant facts. And this phrase, relevant facts, takes us to this question as to what is relevant. There is a fact. What is fact would also be looked into in greater detail later, immediately after all these preliminary discussions and all. But what is relevant? And how is this relevancy determined? And what is the rationale? What is the objective of determining this relevancy? I already said that the objective is to draw the boundaries so that the court's time, energy is saved, and determination is made on the basis of certain facts which have been declared to be relevant. So what is relevant? How is relevancy determined? And if something is not relevant, what happens? If a fact is not relevant, what happens? So I would draw your attention to something which every one of you have seen in especially Bollywood movies. Courtroom dramas are there in Hollywood movies as well, but they seem to be more real. Courtroom dramas in Bollywood movies are real dramas, which you would find to your horror are far, far removed from reality. Many of you might have interned in district courts, and criminal court proceedings might have been witnessed by you. Civil court proceedings might have been witnessed by you. And you would have found that how those proceedings are less glamorous than the proceedings that you watch on the screen. But one thing that I would be importing from those proceedings that you see on screen, often You might have seen a counsel banging on the desk. I object, my lord. What do you object to as a counsel? You object to a certain submission which is being made by the rival counsel. And that submission is not a philosophical submission that is being made. That submission is a factual submission. But you object to that submission, and even if you don't use so many words, what you object to and what you in fact say when you object to is that the submission being made by your opponent is not relevant. Or he is trying to adduce a fact which is not relevant. So what are the standard replies? The standard replies of the presiding judge would be either he would be sustaining the objection, approving the objection, that yes, you can't make this a statement. Why you can't make this a statement? Not only because the statement may be defamatory, for example, because what you are trying to say has no relationship with the question to be determined by the court or the issue that is before the court. Or alternatively, the judge may find that no, the submission being made is allowed, so he would be overruling the objection. Overruling the objection would mean that the submission being made, the fact being presented, relates to what we call a relevant fact. So you would find that during the entire judicial proceeding, and this word judicial proceeding must be kept in mind because today itself I am going to deal with this in greater detail. Throughout the judicial proceeding, or at least during the stage of recording of evidence, the question of relevancy of facts that are in possession of the parties that they intend to proffer assumes utmost importance. So when do you generally object to, when the court generally objects to your submission? Generally the court objects to your submission, or the rival counsel would be objecting to your submission when an irrelevant evidence, irrelevant fact is sought to be proffered, is sought to be adduced. And that's why I have told you that of the three pillars on which the entire superstructure of Indian evidence law stands, the pillar designated as pillar of relevancy is the most important, the strongest. And then you have in chapter 2 all the rules of relevancy, which is very aptly titled of relevancy of fact, chapter 2. So of the three parts that the Indian Evidence Act may be divided, this part of relevancy of facts assumes greater significance, and it would not be exaggeration to say that it is the hub and fulcrum around which the entire Indian Evidence Act revolves. And certainly, though we will be talking about all the three limbs, but a greater emphasis and a greater time would be spent on this limb, on this aspect, on this part of the Indian Evidence Act that we refer to as relevancy of facts. As you would see that determines rules on the basis of which certain facts are relevant. These are not arbitrary, as you would be knowing shortly. Not arbitrary. Not based on some hunches. So, of several terms that you would be exposed to, you would be discussing, you would be dealing with. These three terms assume greater importance, greater significance, and require greater insight, greater understanding, clarity of thought, clarity of understanding. Which three terms? The first one, fact. What is a fact? What do you mean by fact? What do you understand by fact? Then, another term, fact in issue. What do we call fact in issue or facts in issue? If there are multiple facts, of course. How does the court determine fact or facts in issue, both in criminal proceedings and civil proceedings? Are the rules different? And where do we find those rules? Are the rules there in the Indian Evidence Act? Or we need to look beyond the Indian Evidence Act as far as facts in issue and their determination is concerned? And why it is important to determine facts in issue before the proceedings start? And of course, the more magical and slightly elusive term, relevant fact. Relevant. What facts are relevant? Which I told you that require detailed discussion, and this is exactly what is the plan for next classes. But before that, let me talk about another very important development that took place and another very important feature of Indian Evidence Act. Usually, the first provisions in any enactment, in any statutory law, refer to what we call territorial application of that law. To what territories the law applies. And a standard statement that you would find in almost all the central legislations is that this law extends to the whole of India except the state of Jammu and Kashmir. And same was true about the Indian Evidence Act as well. Before 31st of October 2019, when the Jammu and Kashmir Reorganization Act of 2019 changed it all. And it's very interesting to refer to a few provisions of the Jammu and Kashmir Reorganization Act of 2019 and how it affected all the central legislations on the question of territorial application in one stroke, in one go. When you look at the Act of 2019, that JK Reorganization Act, you would find that there are several schedules. Schedule 5 of that legislation. It contains a list, exhaustive list of central legislations that stand amended on the question of territorial application. And to be precise, that fifth schedule contains a list of 106 central legislation, including the Indian Evidence Act, including the Indian Penal Code, including the CRPC that you are studying this semester at different places. For example, at entry 44 or item 44 refers to Indian Evidence Act and amends section 1. to the effect that now the Indian Evidence Act extends to the whole of India without any qualification. Meaning thereby it also extends to the Union territories of Jammu and Kashmir and the Union territory of Ladakh. This is very important development. Similarly, you would find IPC at item number 48, CRPC at item number 9 to the same effect that now IPC and CRPC also apply to the entire territory of India without any qualification. Most of the provisions pertaining to territorial application of that particular law stop here. But Indian Evidence Act goes further. So in a sense, it can be said that whereas such provisions in other legislations, many other legislations, restrict themselves to territorial application, Section 1 of Indian Evidence Act also talks about what we call functional application of Indian Evidence Act. Functional application. It not only talks about to what territorial limits, what are the territorial limits to which Indian Evidence Act would apply. It also talks about to what proceedings the Indian Evidence Act would apply. And this calls for a more detailed inquiry. Doesn't it apply to every proceeding where the proceeding is being held before a judge, before a court, before a quasi-judicial tribunal, before an administrative tribunal? They also, to some extent, determine rights and liabilities. They also return findings. But you would find that Section 1 itself limits the application of Indian Evidence Act to certain proceedings that it calls judicial proceedings and excludes its application, bars its application from certain other proceedings which may appear to be judicial. Meaning thereby, the provisions of Indian Evidence Act or the question of relevancy, for example, or the question of competency of witnesses, or the question of manner of adducing evidence, etc., which are the three limbs of Indian evidence law, have relevance only to judicial proceedings and no other proceedings. What other proceedings this law refers to? And this is something that I must elaborate. And in order to do that, let me read for your benefit Section 1 as it today exists, of course, of Indian Evidence Act. So Section 1 reads, I may not be reproducing it verbatim, but the essence must be presented before you. It reads that the Indian Evidence Act extends to the whole of India, of course, with effect from 31st of October 2019 to Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh Union territories as well, and applies to all judicial proceedings. Underline this phrase, judicial proceedings, in or before any court, excluding court-martial, other than court-martials convened under the Army Act, the Naval Discipline Act, or the Indian Navy Discipline Act of 1934, or the Air Force Act, but not to affidavits presented to any court or officer nor to proceedings before an arbitrator. So what are those proceedings which have been excluded, or where the Indian Evidence Act has no application? Court-martial proceedings. Other than these which have been enumerated in the Army Act, we'll see that how archaic section 1 is, to this extent that it refers to legislations that were passed by the British Parliament, which are no longer applicable to the Indian territory. We'll come to that later. But the obvious exclusions are court-martial proceedings, affidavits that are presented to the court or any officer, and proceedings before an arbitrator. So it can be said, it can be concluded that Indian Evidence Act applies to judicial proceedings in or before any court and has no application to affidavits or proceedings before an arbitrator. But simple as it may seem, the phrase judicial proceedings has led to many decisions, and then the many arguments and counter arguments that need to be presented before you, and also that what proceedings would be judicial proceedings to which the Indian Evidence Act would be applicable. Unfortunately, the Indian Evidence Act does not contain any definition of the phrase judicial proceeding. It has section 3, which is the interpretation clause, where you would find that many words and phrases that have been used throughout the Indian Evidence Act have been interpreted, have been defined, have been described. But one glaring omission, or what we call that, the term judicial proceeding is conspicuous by its absence in the interpretation clause of Indian Evidence Act, that is section 3. And that only complicates this question as to what is judicial proceeding. So 3 informal tests have been evolved over time. 3 informal tests have been evolved over time to determine if a proceeding is judicial in nature or not. Because as I said that it's very categorically laid down in section 1 itself that Indian Evidence Act applies to judicial proceedings in or before a court. So what these 3 tests are, and whether these 3 tests can be invoked one after another separately or have to be invoked together cumulatively, is also something that we will be talking about shortly. The 3 tests, as I already said, are informal tests, include first the objective test. Objective test. Here the word objective should not be understood as antonym to the word subjective. Objective refers to pertaining to object or referring to the object. Now this test was laid down way back in 1887 by Bombay High Court in a celebrated decision, Queen Empress versus Tulja, QLJ, Queen Empress versus Tulja, 1887-12, Bombay, 36. The Bombay High Court laid down this test, and Please listen very carefully that what the court said. The court said that an inquiry is judicial if the object of the inquiry is to determine a jural relation, a legal relation between one person and another person, or a group of persons, between one person and another group of persons, or between a person and the community or the state. So if the inquiry is aimed at, or its object is to determine a legal relationship or a jural relation between one person and another person or persons, or one person and the community or the state, it is a judicial proceeding. But in the same breath, the court also said that even a judge, if he is not acting with such an object, what object? The object to determine a jural relation between these parties. He is not acting judicially, and the proceeding before him cannot be said to be a judicial proceeding. I repeat, the first test that we call the objective test, laid down in 1887 in Queen Empress versus Kulja, looks at this question that whether the object is to determine a jural relationship between the parties. The parties may be two individuals, the parties may be one individual and the community on the other side, or the state, as the case may be. But if a judge is not acting with such an object, he is not acting judicially, and the proceeding before him would not be a judicial proceeding. This is what the court said. The second test is known as functional test. And what is very interesting in this regard is that though the Indian Evidence Act fails to describe what is judicial proceeding, in section 2 clause I of CRPC, the Code of Criminal Procedure of 1973, you have a description of judicial proceeding provided there. Section 2 of the CRPC is the definition clause. Quite a few definitions there. For example, what is the definition of complaint? What is the definition of investigation? What is the definition of inquiry? What is the definition of, say, for example, High Court, this and that. Quite a few definitions. What is the definition of victim? All these definitions are there. One of the definitions there refers to judicial proceeding, and accordingly, judicial proceeding includes any proceeding where evidence is or may be legally taken on oath. Obviously, this description would apply to proceedings before a criminal court, because this has been borrowed from CRPC. But you would find that this is exactly what happens in civil proceedings as well. So judicial proceedings include any proceeding where evidence is or may be legally taken on oath. So it may be before any court, though this definition is in CRPC, but it would apply to civil proceedings as well. This is a functional test. I'll give you examples to make you understand that how these tests work. And the third test is known as approach or process test. Approach test or process test. So whether the process involves application of judicial mind or judicial discretion? Whether the process involves application of judicial mind or judicial discretion, guided by the evidence adduced by the parties. If the answer to this question is yes, you can safely conclude that the proceeding is judicial proceeding. I repeat, whether the process involves application of judicial mind or judicial discretion, guided by the evidence adduced by the party. If the question to this, if the answer to this question, is yes, safely conclude that the proceeding is judicial proceeding. And this exactly distinguishes proceedings before quasi-judicial tribunals, which seem to be judicial in nature. Because you would find that the proceedings before quasi-judicial tribunals do not involve application of judicial mind, which is guided by the evidence adduced by the parties. That is not the case. And in almost all the cases of administrative or quasi-judicial tribunals, you would find that the facts are discovered by the administrative or the quasi-judicial body themselves, irrespective of the evidence that are being adduced by the parties or independent of the facts being presented by the parties. And this goes on to distinguish what we call fact-finding or inquiry commissions, proceeding before fact-finding committees, fact-finding commissions or inquiry commissions, which are constituted under some statute. For example, the inquiry commissions are constituted under the 1952 Act. Take the example of that inquiry commission that has been constituted by the Supreme Court to look into the carnage in Kanpur, that Bikru case. That is headed by a retired Supreme Court judge. It could have been headed by a sitting Supreme Court judge as well. But only because it's headed by a sitting Supreme Court judge, suppose the composition is changed. Currently, it is headed by a retired Supreme Court judge, Justice Chauhan, B.S. Chauhan. Suppose it's headed by a sitting Supreme Court judge. Would that make it or its proceeding a judicial proceeding? Simply because it's headed by a Supreme Court judge, sitting judge of the Supreme Court? No. Not at all. Only because the law says that creates such inquiry commissions or other such bodies, quasi-judicial, administrative, that body shall be deemed to be court for summoning persons, documents, and for invoking natural justice, principles of natural justice. It doesn't render the proceedings before such bodies as judicial proceedings. In the last class, a specific question was asked. What about the Central Administrative Tribunal, CAT? Are the proceedings judicial in nature? The object of asking this question is to know that whether Indian Evidence Act would apply to proceedings before the Indian Central Administrative Tribunal. The answer is no. The Indian Evidence Act has no application to proceedings before the Central Administrative Tribunal or other administrative tribunals, let me tell you. Not only the Indian Evidence Act, the provisions of CPC also don't apply there. So I remember a lot of people would be studying the Indian Evidence Act in their law course and would be interning at some law firm or some other organization, texting me, asking me that, sir, whether Indian Evidence Act applies to proceedings before this tribunal, before this body, for example, where lawyers appear, judges preside over. That is no test that because lawyers appear, judges preside over. It must be a judicial proceeding. These tests have to be employed, and not one by one, but cumulatively, to find an answer to your question. And still a few gray areas would remain. Gray areas. Take the example of section 190 of CRPC. We are running out of time, and